two sides to every tale. The Laestrygonians. An original short story by Jared I. McGee. I couldn't tell you the whole tale, as there's not too terribly much of one to tell. I grew up a shepherd boy of sorts. No, I did not serve or live in the nicest of halls in Fort Lamus, but I was welcome to come and go as I pleased, just as all Laestrygonians were. My days were spent tending sheep out in the verdant fields, just at the tops of the Telepyusian heights. From there, I could see boundless open sea. My work was far from glamorous, but the restful, bucolic surroundings, the gentle company, and the daydream-inducing views were more than enough for me. Never in an eon did I think I would do anything to serve the realm. My brothers had all signed on with King Antiphates' army. Well, 2 went to the army and 1 went to the navy, but the point is, they'd all deigned to serve the king directly. My mother liked to tell me that I was serving the king and country too, just in my own gentler manner. So, imagine my alarm, surprise, and, yes, excitement when I saw small dots on the horizon one morning. Of course, I could see for the gods knew how many spans, so I shrugged it off by the end of the day, going home and putting the sheep away as usual without raising any sort of fuss about the approaching dots on the edge of our world. The next morning, however, it only took me but a glance to see that the dots had become the smallest, barest outlines of ships. They were still so very far away, but I knew interlopers when I saw them. They were not kind ships, filled to the brim with trading materials, but warships. These men were coming to harm us and our way of life. Later, we'd learned that these warriors had been on the high seas for a very long time, and aiming specifically for us for just under a week. I couldn't believe hearing this after the fact. Such terrible premeditation and predetermination toward violence. Luckily, the Laestrygonian mornings are such that there is little time between sunrise and sunset, which made for a quick sleep, and a very small increment of time between my original sightings and my second. These short nights probably saved our lives. I roused the flock, driving them back far earlier than they'd normally go in. This caused confusion among all the herd and out-and-out panic in some individual sheep. However, with a soft hand and a firm voice, I had them moving along nicely in no time at all. I was proud when my father did not question me. He was a retired general for the king, and his belief in my ability to discern between merchant and attacker made my heart sing. He grabbed his sling and spear, and we trotted right back to my usual spot on the cliffs. They'd made considerable time coming into our kind harbor. These people were audacious, to say the least. They sailed right in, throwing anchor and jumping right out of their ships with little concern of possible attack. That was bad. In Laestrygonians' experience, if someone comes with little to no concern of a potential fight, that generally means they are used to fighting and winning. My father pointed out one wayward ship to me with his spear. He reminded me that even if you have 1,000 foolhardy, headstrong men in the same company, there is always one with a bit more of a head about him. A solid black ship was the only one of the miniature fleet not confidently bobbing in the harbor. It looked menacing and lonely, if it were possible for those two to be lumped together. A smaller oared vessel was creeping from the lone piece of coal toward the men waiting on the sands of the beach. This must be their commander. Father made the decision that it was time to report all of this to Lamus. The king and his warriors needed to prepare, though scaling our terrain would be rough on these foreigners. They did not quite know how angry the Laestrygonian geography can be to those who do not know it well. Our jog to the fort was quick. I guess all the adrenaline made things go in a hyperspeed for me. At some point, we'd even stop by the house to grab Mother, Persephone, and the flock. taking them to the safety of the walls of Lammas. Antiphates never allowed his people to feel exposed in times of invasion or war. Unlike many monarchs, he opened his doors to his people. So, there my family stood, reporting to one of the generals that was still close with father all that he and I had seen today. The general and he decided to take the news directly to the king, and, shock of shocks, I was told to come along, that mother and my sister would deal with locking up the flock. The king needed my voice lent to the telling of this tale, as my eyes were keener than father's, and I'd probably seen more. Wow. All this for a shepherd. When we were introduced, we bowed low. I had trouble keeping my head down, to be entirely honest, though. The gold and jewels and women and fancy clothes and jugs of wine, it was just too much to peel my eyes away from. We'd only made it through initial hellos and the like, and were halfway down the walk to the throne, when a commotion started up, there at the end where the king was. Rather quickly, it became apparent to the entire hall that Antiphates' daughter Anthea was out in the fields. The wailing and lamentation coming from the queen was troubling. The wailing and lamentation coming from the king was something otherworldly. Everyone was rushing to the royal couple and swearing to go into the lands and find Anthea. In the melee of distributing the wares that everyone would be assigned to search, I was assigned the brook that we call Artacia, that ran on the far southeast edge of town, just on the edge of the forest land. This seemed odd to me, because that's precisely the path that the foreigners would come up. Wouldn't the king rather have a seasoned soldier go? But no. Despite my father saying as much, the king insisted that I go. He said that, on account of my being a shepherd, I'd be far more fleet-footed than a soldier, and far more gentle-spirited and kind if I found Anthea, helping her stay calm in a time of fear and terror. We all set out like bees bothered from the hive, swarming out onto the fields in our different directions. I quickly realized that I really was fleeter of foot than the larger, more well-muscled men. They lumbered toward their assigned locations. I flew. It was not 20 minutes when I reached the brook at the edge of the wildlands. My heart lurched. I felt myself retch as I bounded behind a tree. There, by the brook, was Anthea and 3 men. Tiny, little men. We knew that Achaeans are smaller than Laestrygonians, but, goodness, these men were mere children next to the bronzed princess. Still, they were armed. Heavily armed. They bristled with spears and knives and other grisly implements of war. What's more, Anthea was clearly in no state for visitors. It looked as though she had chosen to bathe while fetching water, a common occurrence at this far-flung brook, and therefore only had the barest of strips of her white dress wrapped around her, utterly translucent from the water she had been dripping with when confronted by these strange men out of nowhere. Anthea was as poised as a poor shepherd like me would assume a princess would be. Though standing near naked in front of these hostile men, she smiled and interacted like the most dignified of dignitaries, as if she were sent out there as a welcome delegation and ambassador, rather than a nude young woman that had only counted on washing some clothes, washing herself, and bringing some of the Atacia's sweet water back for her and her family to enjoy that evening. I tried to listen to the conversation they were having. All of them spoke through huge smiles, the princess included. The men leered at her breasts, all but licking their lips like the predators they clearly were. I saw Anthea point up to the fortress's walls in the distance. The men nodded. Not only was she beautiful, not only was she unshakable, she was so smart. She was going to take these men to Lammas. She was going to lead them right into the walls where these men would be dealt with by her father and his men. If I were to intrude at this point, I'd likely get myself, and quite likely her, killed in the doing so. As the men rehoisted their packs and shields onto their backs for heavier traveling, Althea turned her back to them, letting the sopping shift drop in order to get redressed for the walk back. That froze me. I felt terrible at looking, yet I could not keep my eyes off of her. This was a good way to get killed for numerous reasons, not to mention a pretty nasty thing to do while the princess thought she could have a private moment to dress. However, I flinched when her deep brown eyes locked with my own. I realized that her ditching the wet gear was more than just her getting comfortable. She must have known I was there the whole time. So, she was a stellar tracker too. She mouthed to me, "Go ahead, warn them," and made a shooing motion with her hands, smiling a wry smile, winking, and cupping her right breast in her hand before beginning to wrap her clothing back around her in the intricate style of the Laestrygonians. What a day. On the heels of that gift from Althea, I bettered my time on the run back to Lammas. I was back in front of the king, the story related, and the men mustered in a matter of 10 minutes upon my re-entry into the fort. The plan was to allow Queen Hestia to greet the men as they entered. She would question them as they approached a table set for banqueting. If she chose the golden goblet, it would be the signal that these men were here for peaceful reasons. If she chose a silver goblet, it was war, and the soldiers would take them. Moreover, the king had deployed a company around the back of the fort, so they could march triple pace toward the cliffs if these men really were here to do us all harm. They each had a strapped barrel on their back full of large stones, and many spears, the top choice for missiles for soldiers' artillery doings. They'd blast those invaders' ships to oblivion. Althea arrived roughly 40 minutes after I had warned the king. She entered, swaying and sashaying as she came in. Everyone in the kingdom knew that she and her mother were as formidable as any warrior in the military branch of the king's servicemen, so this, to everyone but those 3 brash Achaeans, was quite the interesting show by the princess. She handed the men to her mother, Her Majesty Queen Hestia bowing low to the 3 men, making them feel important, as if she were the one scraping and begging for them to think she was worth something and had the lower hand. The petite men and the queen walked slowly to the table, laid full with meats, cheeses, breads, oils, and goblets of wine. They spoke as they approached. They spoke as they selected. The queen looked puzzled, but for a moment. Then she slowly reached out, grasped a silver goblet, and took a long draught. It was not the soldiers, or any of the other men that came out swinging from their concealed places there in the hall. It was Antiphates himself. From where I was stationed, I had a keen view. He knocked all 3 down with one sweep of his massive arms, and bellowed a question about their intentions. They all drew weapons, despite being flat on their backs, and mocked our people, his kingdom, and said the lewdest remarks about Althea one could ever imagine. The king's eyes grew even wider with rage. He put out his right hand, and a soldier appeared out of thin air to put a massive club in it. 1, 2, 3. 3 strikes. 3 dead men. He boomed out an order to attack. A signal flame was lit somewhere on the castle's walls, and the men began to march. My father came to me and insisted we march with the soldiers. I'd had a hand in this, and he would not allow me not to finish what I'd started, or, at minimum, bear witness. I cannot say how quickly we got to the cliffs. I cannot say much about the rest of that battle. No, it was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Achaeans were milling about here and there or sleeping on the beach. When the rocks and javelins and spears and arrows came raining down upon them, they had no time to react, nowhere to go. Our soldiers made short work of them and their ships, quickly whisking away the dead for proper burial. Thus was the Laestrygonian way, after all. Honor even among your foes dead. Again, a lone oared vessel was out on the water, far from the rest of the fleet. The captain of the black ship seemed to be turning tail at the sight of this horror. Our captains could have easily taken that last ship out too, or had the naval forces deploy and attack, though that would have required a bit of a chase. But they came to the conclusion that allowing the Achaeans to live would let the few survivors carry the story of what happens to those who threaten us. The ship limped its way in the general direction of the Iaian island, the home of the deadly and painfully beautiful Circe. No doubt, His Majesty would send word to her and her women that they had men coming their way and to have their fun with them. So, that is the story that I remember about the day those awful Achaeans came to savage our homeland. For a day, I was something more than a shepherd. As the time passed, it seemed our tale had been manipulated by those few survivors. Circe later told us of the monstrosities they'd accused us of, even directly in the wake of our battle. But their experiences with our dear Circe, well, that's another tale, and it is not mine to tell. Thank you for listening to Two Sides to Every Tale, the Laestrygonians. All three of the backing tracks for this story were taken from the Free Music Archive. The first track is titled Farm Montage, instrumental, and the second, New England is Interesting, both original pieces from the album Old Paper Houses by BOPD. They are being used under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial 3.0 unported licenses. The last track is titled Marimo and is by Blue Dot Sessions. It is being used under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial 4.0 International license. Thank you to BOPD and the Blue Dot Sessions for sharing their music with the world. And thank you to Free Music Archive for providing a means for artists to do so. I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this little take on a classic tale. Please let me know if you did, as the two side to every tale concept could easily become a series. Now, we'll revisit another age-old story in Always the Servant.